Recently, the mod developer I have on screen now made a new mod for Terraria that not only turns you into Kirby, but also allows you to use its special abilities, like being able to inhale enemies, and more importantly, get special power-ups from those enemies. So, that made me wonder if it's possible to beat Terraria only using Kirby and its power-ups as my weapon, which is exactly what I attempt in this video. In this playthrough, I'll only be using the abilities to beat bosses. This mod also just came out, and is still in beta, meaning the developer is still actively working on it. So, while I didn't run into any issues with it in this playthrough, don't be surprised if you do end up running into small issues here and there. And with all that out of the way, let's finally jump into the playthrough. After spawning into my new world, I noticed I spawned in with 2 new items, with the first being the one that actually turns me into Kirby when equipped, and then the second one being what I use when I want to use one of Kirby's attacks. I obviously started messing around with everything to see what I could do, and quickly found out I could fly a good bit, and there was no fall damage. After this, I started getting wood for my NPC houses, and ended up finding a slime. So I decided to go ahead and eat him to see what power-up I'd get, and ended up becoming a slime Kirby that would bounce every time I moved, but seemingly couldn't attack. So I removed the power-up, but then picked the star back up, because I wanted to see if I could damage things by shooting it back out. And it turned out I was right! I got back to making my houses, and once I finished them, I started exploring the right side of my world, which is when I got to see this mod's special death animation, which was a super nice addition. Once I respawned, I started exploring the left side of the world until I ran into a living tree, and after looting it, I just decided to start mining now as well. Since I could fly, exploring the caves became a lot easier. So it didn't take me long to find some life crystals, good loot chests with helpful accessories, and more. So after I started to get annoyed with mining, I went back to my base. Once I got there, I started going through everything I picked up from my mining trip, but I ended up seeing a zombie out of my house, and I wanted to see what power-up I'd get from eating it. So that's exactly what I did, which seemingly gave me a zombie power-up. This one came with 2 attacks, with the first being one where you swing a zombie arm, and the second one being one where you can shoot projectiles out, but it has a cooldown. I got back to working on my base, and more specifically, a building for storage and crafting stations, and once I finished with that, I made another NPC house. By the time I got done with that house though, it was well into the day, so I decided to go back to mining, which is when I figured out that this zombie power-up is pretty strong for something you can easily get, but not strong enough for the underworld, which is where I eventually ended up dying at on this mining trip. By this time though, the merchant had already moved in. So, after placing everything I stole from the underworld, I bought the anvil and went over to my other building to upgrade some of my gear into golden stuff. After this, I waited till night so I could get another zombie power-up. And once I had that, I started building another NPC house, which finally helped my stack of houses look slightly better. And then I went out to try and farm lenses, so I could fight the Eye of Cthulhu. I ended up dying before I could find enough demon eyes, but when I respawned, I decided to check out this mod's crafting recipes to see if there was anything besides the item I spawned with, and found out I can make globe versions of the power-ups that I assumed worked kind of like the games, where you can use them to get any power-up whenever you want, which did end up being the case clearly. So I decided to try and make one of them, but the only one that I saw that I could easily make right now was the blue slime one. So I pushed off making any of them, since the slime power-up seemingly doesn't do much, for now at least. After this, I decided to do some mining in the jungle. And then, after I went to check out my corruption biome, as I wanted to see if the corruption enemies would give me any power-ups, which didn't end up being the case. I did figure out that, unlike the games, you can suck up an infinite amount of enemies in one go, instead of just one. And I also noticed that when you shoot out a star that has multiple enemies, it does more damage. So, this got me thinking that it might be possible to just suck up a ton of enemies by sitting in one area for a while, and then insta-kill a boss with the star. So, my plan was to test this on the first boss I'd fight. So, I went back to my base to grab some materials, went back over to the corruption to craft a king slime spawner, and then went back to the surface of the corruption to start collecting enemies. I don't know exactly how many I got, I just kept going until it started to get dark, as I thought that would be long enough. And then I spawned King Slime. Once he teleported to me, I had King Slime lined up, which is when I took the shot. I ended up being correct in the fact that I could probably insta-kill a boss like this. But I didn't end up doing it this time. Instead, King Slime just had a tiny bit of health left, so I had to finish him off by shooting another enemy at him. After this, I went back home, made another NPC house, which made my stack house go back to being oddly ugly, and then I went back to trying to get more lenses so I could fight the Eye of Cthulhu, which I was finally able to finish doing. After this, I went back to the corruption, made the Eye of Cthulhu spawner, and then went back to the surface and started to collect more enemies. Now, before you worry, I'm not planning on doing this for every boss, but I do want to at least insta-kill one boss this way, so might as well do it on the Eye of Cthulhu, since it wouldn't be too hard to beat anyways. Once I had enough enemies, I decided to go back home and do the fight, so that way I didn't have to worry about the corruption enemies. Then, once it was night, I spawned the Eye of Cthulhu, shot my star, and got the satisfaction of finally insta-killing a boss with this possibly broken mechanic. Now that I had the Eye of Cthulhu beaten, I only had 2 bosses left in pre-hard mode, if we aren't counting the Wall of Flesh. So, I decided to try and go ahead and get them over with, starting with Skeletron. So, I went over to the dungeon, waited until it was night, started the fight, and insta-killed. Yeah, sorry, I lied about not doing it again. I had to do it one more time, since it's so fun. But this is for sure the last time I do it in this playthrough. After this, I started exploring the dungeon, hoping to find the mechanic, but only ended up dying. And since it was night when I respawned, I just decided to wait until morning before going back out there. And in the meantime, I spent the night building more houses. Once I was back in and exploring the dungeons though, I ended up eating a Tim, which surprisingly gave me a Tim power-up that allowed me to shoot Tim's projectile as my own weapon. And it was pretty good, until I ended up dying. After going back to the dungeon, not finding the mechanic, and dying multiple more times, I thought I should try the other pre-hard mode boss, which in my case is the Eater of Worlds. So, I went down into the corruption, started blowing up shadow orbs, which is where I got the light pet. But before breaking the 3rd orb, I ended up dying to multiple devourers. Feeling like both things I needed to do now were annoying me, I went back to the dungeon to look for the mechanic, and luckily actually ended up finding her this time. Now that I was mostly done with the dungeon, I went back to my base to make some more houses, alongside some other building things. And then I remembered the globes I mentioned earlier. I decided that I wanted to try and get all of them throughout this playthrough, so I went ahead and started working on crafting the only one I could easily do at the time, which was still the slime one. For this one, I just needed gel, which I already had, and then glass, which I had to get sand from the desert for. But after getting back to my base, turning that sand into glass, I was able to make my first globe of the playthrough. Once I made it though, I realized that if I wanted to get every globe in this mod, I should probably just go ahead and make a dedicated area for them now, which is exactly what I did. After finishing that building though, I started to feel like I was just wasting time. So I went back to the corruption to try and beat the Eater of Worlds again. And while I was actually able to get it to spawn this time around, I still ended up dying regardless. After this, I realized that I could make one of the fire globes pretty easily too, which would let me use a new power-up I haven't tried yet. So that's exactly what I did. This fire power-up has a pretty strong fire spray attack that I can spam, or a dash attack that moves me a good bit in whatever direction I'm facing, but it has a cooldown. With this new power-up, I thought I might be strong enough to take on the Wall of Flesh. So I went down to the underworld, spent what felt like forever looking for a voodoo doll, and once I finally had one, I went ahead and used it. Unsurprisingly, I did end up eventually dying and losing this fight. But with the fire power-up, I was able to take out most of the Wall of Flesh's health, so I knew that I was at least on the right path to beating it. Once I respawned, I spent some time looking for life crystals, and ended up finding a total of 6 before I went back down to the underworld, and started looking for another voodoo demon so I could fight the Wall of Flesh. And after a little bit, I found one. Once I had the doll, I got really far over to the right side of the underworld, and threw the doll into the lava to start the fight. This time, with the little extra help, I was able to do a lot better this time. So good, in fact, that I got cocky at the very end of the fight, and ended up dying while the Wall of Flesh only had about 100 health left. Since I got it so low, I just decided to immediately go back down, find another voodoo demon, and try fighting the Wall of Flesh again, which luckily ended up being the right decision, as I was finally able to beat it this time around. As soon as I got back to my base, I started looking for my Hallow biome, so I could get the Souls of Light I needed for the mech bosses. And I started with searching the left side of the world, which ended up being the right choice, as it wasn't long before I found it in my snow biome. After I started going down into it though, I ended up dying to a trap. On my way back over there, I remembered that I needed to break some altars. So, after I made a pit stop in the corruption to do just that, I went back home to make some demonite gear so I could start mining the new ore. And then I finally made my way back to the Hallow biome. I ended up spending a while here, as not only did I eventually get the 10 Souls of Light I needed, but I was also able to find enough ore to make the mithril anvil that I needed, and even the Goblin Tinkerer and Party Girl NPCs. After this, I went back to my base and started going through and putting up everything I collected while I was out in the Hallow. After this, a goblin invasion started, and since my base was also my spawn, I sadly had to deal with this right now instead of pushing it off till later. So, after dying a few times and losing 3 doors, the invasion was defeated. Now that I was free to get back to doing what I wanted, I started by making 3 new NPC houses. But then afterwards, I went over to the corruption biome to get the few souls of night that I needed, which were also the last crafting material I needed for all 3 of the mech boss spawners. So, after making all of them, I got started on my boss arena. For this, I just went with a very simple design, where there are just a ton of platforms, and of course, the campfire. I made it in the jungle, as the other side of my world was heavily infected with corruption. So, I thought that I was avoiding having to deal with a constant spam of enemies. But what I totally forgot at the moment was that the jungle isn't much better in that aspect. Eventually, I finally finished the arena, but instead of immediately making the mechanical boss spawners and fighting them, I decided to go and see if I could find a queen bee spawner, as I totally forgot about her so far in this playthrough. Surprisingly, it ended up taking a good bit of time before I found my first hive, which also happened to have the wizard spawn on top of it. Once I was in it though, I started the fight and got to work on beating it only using the fire ability. And within only a couple of minutes, Queen Bee was defeated. After this, I got back to work on the mechanical bosses, with the only thing left for me to do before fighting them was to try and find a new Kirby ability, as my fire one was starting to feel a bit too overpowered. I first tried to craft the second fire power-up, which required some living fire blocks. So I went down to the underworld and started farming enemies. But I didn't end up finding any of them, even after fighting the Wall of Flesh again. So instead, I moved on to trying to get the ice power-up. For this, I went deep into the snow biome's cave and found a cyan beetle to eat, which ended up changing me into the ice power-up. This one let me spam both attacks, with the first one having me blow out freezing air that can actually freeze enemies in place, and the second one being a projectile where I seemingly shoot out chunks of ice that deal a good amount of damage. With this new power-up, I was ready to fight the mechanical bosses. So, after making all 3 of the spawners, and then waiting for night, I finally went out to start the fights, starting with the twins. This fight ended up being the hardest out of the 3, and the ice power-up didn't make it any easier. The freeze effect didn't seem to work on the twins, which wasn't too shocking. But on top of that, because both of the attacks had a very short range, the fight seemed to drag on forever. But eventually, I was finally able to defeat one, and then the second one as well. Since I already had the spawners, I just decided to wait until the next night and fight the next mech boss. But while I was waiting, I started looking for a new power-up for my player, which is when I found out that there was a power-up I was really close to being able to craft, which was the laser one, with the only thing standing in the way of me being able to craft it being the destroyer. So once it was night, that's the one I decided to fight. This fight was a little bit better than the twins fight, with me bringing the fire globe over to the setup in case the ice power also ended up being a bad option for this fight, which ended up being the case. But once I switched over to the fire ability, the fight really sped up, with me eventually beating it around 3 AM in game. After this, I picked the fire globe back up and went back to my base to craft the laser globe so I could try out that power up. This one only had a single attack, which was, unsurprisingly, a laser. But after testing it out on enemies, I thought that it seemed pretty powerful. So that's what I planned on using in the last mechanical boss fight with Skeletron Prime. So once it was night, I went over to my arena, spawned Skeletron Prime, and started fighting it. Unlike the other 2 fights, this one ended up being extremely easy, and the laser having a high range just made it even easier. So it wasn't too long until Skeletron was defeated. After this, I immediately went over to my underground jungle, as not only did I need to find the Plantera bulb so I can fight the next boss, I also needed to start looking for life fruits. After a while of exploring, I didn't end up finding any life fruits, but I did eventually find a Plantera bulb. So I cleared some land so I could get a good place for the fight, and once that was done, I broke the bulb and started the fight. The fight was pretty hard, since I didn't have a lot of room to move around in. But luckily, I had a small loop that I could use to get away while healing. So, after a while of running away, spamming it with a laser attack, going back to running away, and doing this cycle over and over, eventually, Plantera was finally defeated. By this point, I was a little tired of fighting bosses, so after picking up the loot from Plantera, I went back to my base and did some building, as I needed more NPC houses anyway. Once I realized I spent too long building these 10 out of 10 gorgeous houses, I went back to the jungle to fight the next boss, Golem. Luckily, I already knew where the jungle temple was, since the top of it was sticking out where I fought Plantera. This fight was probably the easiest so far out of the hard mode bosses I fought. I first started by removing the traps and spikes from the main room. Then, once the fight started, I just spammed him with lasers. And with that, it didn't take too long until Golem was defeated. And since this and the past few boss fights all went pretty smoothly, instead of upgrading any of my gear, I instead went straight to the dungeon to fight the Cultist, which I ended up dying to pretty fast. So I sadly knew I had to stop being lazy and upgrade at least some of my gear. I started by going back to the jungle and looking for life fruits again. And luckily, this time around, I was able to find a few. Aside from that though, I built 3 new houses, built a boss arena by the dungeon, and finally went to my Aether biome so I could shimmer a life crystal, which turns it into a vital crystal, which is a permanent upgrade that boosts how fast I regenerate health. Once I finally finished doing all of that, I went back over to the dungeon to try and fight the Cultist again. And while I did get further than I did last time, I still ended up dying again. This made me take another look at the power-up globes to see if there were any more that I could craft at the moment, and realized that there was a second fire power-up that I could probably craft after a single trip down to the underworld. So I made my way down there, spent what felt like way too long for some living fire blocks to drop, and then came back up to my base to make the globe. Although this power-up was available from the start of hard mode, it was seemingly better than the laser, with it having a long-ranged fire attack that I could spam, and an extremely useful dash attack that could shoot you out a good distance. But it has a cooldown. Now that I had the new power-up, alongside me changing out some accessories, I still didn't feel like I could definitely beat the Cultist. But regardless of that, I decided to just go ahead and try to fight him again, since it's not like I had to worry about wasting a spawner, which ended up going a lot better than expected. This time around, I was seemingly able to deal more damage each attack, so I knew I could beat the Cultist using this new fire ability. I just had to get lucky and hope that I could get away from him long enough to heal myself, which luckily ended up being the case for this fight, as I eventually ended up beating him. And now that the Cultist was defeated, I had to immediately deal with the pillars. My base was perfectly in between 2 pillars, so I teleported there, and then decided to start with the pillar on the left side of my base, which was the Vortex pillar. This fight basically was just me running into the pillar area, dealing a little bit of damage to it before dying, and then repeating that cycle over and over until I eventually finally beat it. After that, I went to go do the pillar on the right side of my base, which was the Stardust pillar. This pillar was a lot easier than the Vortex one enemy-wise, and the fact it spawned right in the middle of my boss arena just made it even easier. So, after only dying a couple of times, this pillar was defeated. After this, I decided to try and fight the Nebula pillar, since it was in the middle of the boss arena I made by the dungeon. So, I was expecting the fight to be easy like the Stardust pillar. But I think that this was the pillar I ended up dying the most on. Eventually though, I defeated the Nebula pillar through brute force, and I was on to the 4th and final one, the Solar pillar. This one was on the far right side of my world, so it was definitely annoying to have to run back over to it each time I died. But I luckily didn't have to do that too much, as this fight was easier than the Nebula fight, but harder than the other pillars. So while it did end up taking a while, I eventually defeated it, which started spawning Moonlord. Right after this, I teleported back to my base, started making my way over to the boss arena I made for the mechanical bosses. And by the time I made it there, it wasn't too long until Moonlord finally spawned in. Right away, I was shocked by the fact that the fight was seemingly easier than most of the recent boss fights I had to do, as not only were my attacks dealing a good amount of damage, I could also tank a ton of hits from Moonlord with the help of potions. Eventually though, I got a little too cocky and wasn't watching my health, which caused me to die. But this really wasn't a bad thing. Once I respawned, I used the materials I got from the pillars to craft another Moonlord spawner, a Stardust Dragon Staff, and then I went right back to the boss arena to try and fight the Moonlord again. This time, I made sure to keep an eye on my health the entire time, and my Stardust Dragon ended up being extremely useful, as it was also able to deal a noticeable amount of damage. Once I got to the second phase, the attacks got to the point where I wasn't able to easily tank them, but at the same time, my Stardust Dragon was able to constantly attack Moonlord, since its heart is constantly exposed in this phase. Eventually though, after a ton of potions and fire dashes to dodge attacks, Moonlord finally lost the last bit of its health, meaning I finally beat Terraria only using Kirby. That wraps up this playthrough. Thanks for sticking to the end. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos like this in the future. And as always, make sure to have a wonderful day.